Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Sid Kennedy, Executive Director of the Homewood Research Institute. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the Homewood Research Institute is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis peoples, and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. It's actually a coincidence that today is also Bell Let's Talk Day. And Bell will donate funds to mental health initiatives in Canada by contributing 5 cents for every text, call, tweet, or TikTok video using number Bell Let's Talk. It's not too late to join the conversation. So for tonight's session, I will be moderating a conversation with our special guest for approximately 30 minutes, focusing on the role of the microbiome and really what we've learned in recent years. This will be followed by a question and answer session from you, the audience, for approximately 20 minutes. And we hope to finish sharp at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. So Homewood Research Institute is a national charity dedicated to applied research that transforms mental health and addiction treatments in Canada and around the world. We work with some of North America's most influential scientists, clinicians, and trainees in 4 priority areas: trauma, addiction, digital information, and evaluation science. Through Homewood Talks, we hope to explore the meaning and impact of research on our daily lives and empower you with knowledge about novel mental health and addiction research that may have an impact in your life in the future. Tonight, we will explore the emerging knowledge about the connection between the microbiome, health, the gut-brain connection, and implications for mental health. I just learned a few minutes ago that we have over 300 registrants from across Canada and at least a dozen special guests from countries worldwide that we give a special welcome to. So, as an interactive forum, we invite you to enter your questions in the Q&A at any time. info@hriresearch.com is our address if you wish to connect with us after the presentation. You may submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button. If you're at any time uncomfortable or anyone around you, feel free to reach out for support, and we encourage you to visit wellnesstogether.ca, Wellness Canada, where you can access mental health and substance use support 24/7. We are very grateful for sponsors of HRI Talks, and tonight it's my pleasure to acknowledge Fusion Homes, who are the sponsors of this evening's event. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest for this evening, Professor Emma Allen-Vercoe. Dr. Virko has a PhD in molecular microbiology through an industrial partnership with Public Health England. She's a professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Molecular and Cellular Biology at the University of Guelph, where she's developed a world-class anaerobic microbiology facility to emulate the conditions of the human gut. Professor Virko has received several Canadian Foundation for Innovation awards, allowing her to further this work in her laboratory. In 2013, she co-founded New Biota, a company whose mission is to develop microbial ecosystem therapeutics to treat disorders related to dysfunction of the gut microbiome. She received her Tier 1 Canada Research Chair to study the gut microbiome and its linkage to human health and disease. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Emma Allen-Vercoe. So, Dr. Virko, welcome to HRI Talks. And I'd like to start off by asking, I noticed that you describe yourself as a microbial ecologist. So that's not an everyday scientist term. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that. And what was it that attracted you into this field of science?
Sure. So that's a great question, because what's kind of interesting is that I never set out to be a microbiologist. When I was growing up, I wanted to be an astronaut. I think many people did. That morphed into being an astrophysicist. And then I realized that while I was good at math, I wasn't very good at math. And so I wasn't good enough to be an astrophysicist. And so biochemistry was what I went to university to do my first degree in. And I very, very nearly dropped out because I really hated it. And it wasn't until my third year of my degree that I was placed in a work experience lab, as in a microbiology lab, that I kind of realized actually microbiology really is great. And the sort of light bulb moment came on. And so I started studying microbes, and this was back in the early 90s. I'm aging myself now. And at that time, no one was studying the microbiome. And very few people were microbial ecologists. So I didn't know anything about that. I was studying, like many people were studying, I was studying pathogens and things that make us sick. And it wasn't until I finished my PhD and then I realized that that there was this whole other world of microbiology that no one was really talking about or doing much with. And I thought to myself, I could really do this. I could really look at this, because I really like to look at the things that no one else likes to look at and do the things that no one else likes to do. So I decided then and there that that's what I was going to launch my career in. And so microbial ecology is the study of microbes in an ecosystem. So how do microbes work together? So the traditional way to study microbes is to study individual microbes on their own, grown in petri dishes or whatever. And microbial ecology is very different to that, because what we do there is we look at the whole ecosystem and how the microbes interact with each other and the products that they produce. And that's very, very essential for human microbiome research, because the human microbiome is an ecosystem and you can't just look at one or two microbes. You have to really look at the whole group of microbes to understand how they might be how they might be interacting with us and our health.
Maybe just a clarification for a lot of the audience, perhaps. Could you clarify the difference between the microbiome and the microbiota?
Yes, that's another good question. And actually, they're pretty much used interchangeably these days. So originally, the definition was that the microbiota is the biomass, so the actual microbes themselves that we would find in a given ecosystem. Now, tonight we're talking about the human microbiota, so we're talking about the microbes that live in and on humans. And the microbiome is the term that originally was coined to talk about the whole microbiome, the whole ecosystem, but has actually morphed into more about talking about the genetic part of it. So about the DNA, the DNA that the microbes have. And so microbiome is kind of used interchangeably now with microbiota. They kind of mean the same thing, I would say.
Thank you. So how does the microbiome become impaired, and what are you learning about in terms of the effects on our health?
Well, there's a lot that we need to unpack there, because there's the microbiome of a human is an incredibly enormous ecosystem, and so I study the microbiome of the gut. And so if you would imagine that the human body as a planet, then as the planet Earth, then the gut, and particularly the colon, is the super city, is the Mexico City of the microbiome. And so there's an awful lot of microbes there. So we are actually mostly microbes. So if you take all the microbes out of your body and you stack them up and compare them to all the cells, the human cells in your body, you'd actually have slightly more microbial cells than you have human cells. So we're slightly more microbial than human. And so most of those microbes, as I said, exist in our gut, and there's many different types, and everyone has a different gut microbiome. And that's one of the key things to understand here, is that you have what we have coined a poo print, which basically means it's a little bit like a fingerprint. You have a collection of microbes in your gut, around 200 to 300 different bacterial species, countless different strains, many other types of microbes as well. And that microbiome is unique to you, like a fingerprint. And to some extent, unless you really mess with it, it stays with you for from the point of time that you start to develop, to the point that you wean, and then on through your life. And actually, many of those microbes, it seems, stay with us for very long periods of time. So they're very, very a very important part of our bodies, and we have to kind of consider that they are. They're an integral part of us. So in the past, we have kind of ignored them, just kind of thinking that these microbes hang along, they're just along for the ride, they're just kind of using us as a vessel in which to live. And we really have to turn that view on its head, because they're doing far more than that. They interact with us in extremely important ways. They have a major effect on our health, and as we're realizing now, effects and that their reach is into almost every component of our bodies. They have some kind of effect. And so the importance of studying the microbiome, it can't be underestimated. It really is a very, very important area to study. And as I said, I study the gut microbiome through default. Really, it's actually relatively easy to study, because you can just take stool samples and you can get a good readout of what's going on in the gut based on stool samples. And so, and because it is such an incredibly vast ecosystem, then that means that I'll have more than enough to study for the rest of my life, I imagine.
So I guess there are other people who are studying skin microbes, or they're studying bladder, or
yes.
Lots of different, yeah. So that gives us a bit of a sense of what symbiotic functional relationship between the microbiome and the human, even if we are outnumbered in terms of cells. But what happens in terms of when the microbiome become sick, for want of a better word, when they become impaired? What are you learning about how they affect our health? Right,
yeah. So it's a very big topic and a very difficult one to understand. But what we are beginning to realize is that everyone, as I said, has a unique microbiome. But what is interesting is if you took all of the functions of those microbes, so the things that they're doing rather than what they're called, and you take a look at that, then we're actually a lot more similar to each other. So it's not really about what the microbes are, it's about what they're doing. And what we're starting to understand that for a whole group of diseases, and the list just keeps getting bigger, is something called diversity is extremely important, diversity of the microbiome. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mentioned that we have, many, many different species of, let's say, bacteria in our guts. We've got many other microbes in there too. And what seems to be very clear, and certainly for the gut microbiome, is that the more species that you have, so the more diversity that you have, the less likely you are to have disease. And so very many diseases are associated with a lack of diversity or a reduced diversity. And now that's a very difficult thing to unpack as well, because causality and association are very different things. So just because there's a lower diversity of species in someone's microbiome doesn't necessarily mean that they are going to be sick or that they are sick. It's more of an association that we're noticing. And now we're trying to understand why and what it is that these microbes are doing. And what it does seem to come down to is, as I said, what the microbes are doing is important. And one of the things that you have to appreciate is that microbes have been on this earth for many billions of years longer than we have, or several billion years longer than we have. And as a result, their biochemistries and what they can do with biochemistry is incredibly intricate and very clever. Mm-hmm. And as human beings who really just, we haven't been around nearly as long as microbes, our biochemistry is not nearly as sophisticated. And so what the microbes definitely do offer us, along with many other things, but one of the things that I study in particular that they offer us is the ability to carry out biochemical reactions to make products that we can actually use in our bodies that are actually very important to our health. And
we could obviously go on
yes.
this. I think it would be very interesting. But I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about how you actually work in your lab and how you study the microbiome?
For sure. So I have a little slideshow here just to show you some of the things that that we do in my lab. Can you see the screen? Is that? Can you see that's up? Okay. So one of the things that we have developed is something called the RoboGut, which is just really a way that we can study some microbes from the gut as an ecosystem outside of the human body. And that's important because we want to do nasty things to these microbes sometimes to see what the effect is. And so we don't really want to do that in a human. So if we take the microbes out of the human, and really you can think of the RoboGut as a life support system for the microbes in the gut, then you can do all these sorts of nasty things, and you can sample the ecosystem. You don't have to ask permission, and so we can learn a lot about it. So this is Simone, a PhD student from my lab, standing in front of the RoboGut, and there she is on the right-hand side actually sampling the RoboGut. So it looks like a lot of glass and stainless steel, and on the bottom right there's a couple of images of what the actual ecosystem looks like. So this is an ecosystem from the gut actually of a healthy individual. So you can see it's sort of looks like brown mush, but we love this stuff because we can actually follow what the microbes are doing inside the ecosystem, which is quite a very easy thing to do when it's in vitro like this, when it's on the laboratory bench. And if you look at this image, what we're doing here is actually we're culturing some of the microbes from the gut. And one of the reasons that this ecosystem has never really been studied until the last few decades is because the microbes that live in your gut are extremely anaerobic, which means that they hate oxygen. They can't survive in the presence of oxygen. So we have to take oxygen out of the atmosphere for them. And so we grow them in these little chambers with these little glove boxes on them. And inside these chambers, there's no oxygen whatsoever. So these microbes can live quite happily. And so there's Simone again, working with some of the microbes. I mentioned that we look at what the microbes are doing in terms rather than what they are. And this is one of the ways that we do it. We use a technique called nuclear magnetic resonance. And this is my PhD student, Avery. standing by one of our smaller nuclear NMR instruments in the at the University of Guelph. And although it's smaller, it's taller than she is, so it's still quite big. So what this is you can think of it as like a giant electromagnet. And so what we do is we put our little samples in of the metabolites that we get from the robogut. And in these metabolites are lots of chemicals, and these chemicals all actually resonate a bit like a tuning fork at a certain frequency when you apply a magnetic field. And so what we do is we put them in this instrument, we apply a magnetic field, and a computer picks up the resonance that we see and interprets it so that we can actually see what the molecules are, and we can tell what the molecules are. And this is really cool because microbes talk to each other and to our bodies using small molecules that they make. And what we're doing here essentially is eavesdropping on the conversations that these microbes have with our bodies. So this is what we use here. So that's the NMR. And then here, this is sequencing. So the other part of looking at microbes is understanding what their genetic components are. To look at that, we have to sequence the DNA. And this is a really nifty little machine called a GridION that we have. Just to put it in perspective for you, so back in 2000, the first bacterial genome was sequenced, or around about 2000, and it cost a few $1 million and took several years and many different labs worth of effort. So we can do the same work now in about 2 hours with one person and one instrument. And this is the instrument that we use. This is called the GridION, as I mentioned. And this is Keith here loading the GridION, and he's just going to put one of these little tiny flow cells onto the instrument. It's just a little plastic flow cell. It's quite incredible technology with a little membrane that DNA can pass through. And as it passes through the membrane, there's a charge that is measured by a computer, and that can interpret the sequencing, the sequence of the DNA strand. And we do that because it's a flow cell. There's many pores. It can do that in what we call massively parallel way, so that we can sequence an enormous amount of data in a very short period of time. So that's Keith loading it, and you can see here as well. This is in real time. The instrument is measuring the DNA bases going through the flow cell. So what you see there is a little optical map of the flow cell. DNA is flowing through it, and that's DNA is being read. So it's a really incredible technology. It's revolutionized the way that we can study the microbiome, because now we can look at these microbial ecosystems in a very, very straightforward way.
Amazing technology. People are certainly in the mental health field very aware of the gut-brain axis, as often described. Could you tell us about what are the links between the gut biome and the brain and mental health?
Yes. Well, we're seeing more and more. So, and it's been a really surprising journey. So I think the first thing I would say is that now we understand that microbes are very important. Microbes in the gut in particular are very important in terms of inflammation. And inflammation, it turns out, is a very important component of a lot of diseases, including mental health. So the more inflammation you have, the more mental health issues you might have as well, you might experience. As well as that, microbes process a lot of the foods that we eat. And by doing so, they make a lot of these chemicals, these small molecules, of things that we measure with the NMR instrument. And those small molecules, some of those are actually neuroactive. So it might come as a surprise to some of the audience members that that there are microbes in the gut that can make a lot of the neuroactive compounds that you may have heard of, like serotonin and GABA and dopamine. The microbes in the gut only make very small amounts of these things. But the fact that they do means that they speak the same language that we do. and they can process these kinds of chemicals, and they use the same kinds of chemical pathways to do so. And so they may be doing the same kind of thing to the neuroactive compounds that we produce. And so there's an interplay between both of them. And as well as that, microbes in the gut seem to be important in terms of stimulating the vagus nerve, which is the sort of superhighway connection, if you like, between the gut and the brain. So that vagus nerve, most of the traffic actually goes from the gut to the brain rather than from the brain to the gut. So there seems to be a lot of connections and a lot of chatter between microbes in the gut and the brain. And we don't really understand what all of those are yet. There's many different things that could be happening there. And as well as the vagus nerve, that we have an incredibly rich network of nerves that go to our gut. So often we hear the term, you have a gut feeling. There's a lot of truth in that. And those nerves as well seem to also be associated with, or they seem to be stimulated by products from the human gut microbiome. And we don't really know the full extent of that, because it's only in recent years that we've appreciated that these microbes can speak to us at all. And so before that, as I mentioned, we just kind of thought that they were just sitting there doing not too much. And so it's really quite astonishing how much our microbes can influence our mental health. We know this as well, because if you take experimentally, you can take an animal and make it what we call germ-free. So you can clear the microbes from a mouse, let's say, and then you can put microbes back in from any other mouse. And so when you do that, you can really see the power of the microbiome. So for example, there's a very famous experiment that was done a few years ago now up the road at McMaster University. And what they did here was quite amazing. What they did is they took two different types of mouse, one which was a very anxious type mouse. It's a strain of mouse called a C57 Black 6, if you're interested. But everyone uses them because they're very timid and they're very easy to handle. And then there's another strain of mouse called an NIH Swiss mouse, and those are really aggressive mice. And so they're a good model for lots of things, but they're very aggressive and very difficult to work with. And so what the researchers at McMaster did is they cleared the microbes out of these animals, so they raised them germ-free, if you like, and then they switched the microbiomes from one animal to the other. So the anxious type mouse got the confident, aggressive mouse's microbiome, and vice versa. And what was really incredible was that the behaviors of the mice changed as a result. So there's really good evidence that these microbes are actually having an effect on behavior, and that's been shown many times now. And so there's lots of things that you can do to understand how that might be happening. And really it comes down to the molecules that the microbes are making, and that's what we're trying to understand now.
So this is a slight aside, but I'll just briefly comment. Michael Meany, who was at McGill for many years and a very famous scientist, actually showed that highly anxious, what would be high-licking mothers, could be given the offspring of a low-licking mother and vice versa. And not only did the offspring of those pups subsequently change their behavior from being a high licker if they were fostered by a low-licking mother or vice versa, but they continued the generations to maintain that change. And that was often seen as an epigenetic phenomenon. Would that be linked in any way, do you think, to the gut microbiome?
Yes, I think so. And the reason I say that is because the more that we look, the more that we can see that the microbiome, and more correctly, the molecules that the microbiome can make, actually do affect the epigenetics of an organism. And so they can't change your genes, of course, but they can change the way that your genes are expressed and the way that they are then sort of passed down. And so that's a really important point, and actually explains, or could explain, quite a lot of some of the heritability of some of the mental disorders.
So I'm going to ask one last question. How do we keep our gut microbiome happy and healthy?
That's the million-dollar question. I think there's lots of ways. The major one is diet, believe it or not. So diet is the #1 modulator for the microbiome that we utilize every day, that we interact with every day. And we're beginning to realize that, and perhaps have realized for quite some time, and probably not a surprise, that the diet of people in the Western world, or the developed world, is actually a very poor diet. And what do I mean by poor? Well, it's not that it's that we're not getting enough nutrients, you know, from the point of view of we're getting enough carbohydrates and fats and proteins, but it's the quality of those things, and that's important. So, for example, in the Western diet, we eat a lot of refined sugars. So this is sugar that has been broken down so that it is easier to digest, and that means that we digest it very quickly, and it becomes, it's of course it's used as energy by our human bodies. But the problem with that is that none of it gets sort of makes it down into the colon. And as I mentioned, the colon is kind of the hotbed of where the action is in terms of the microbiome. And so what happens there is, if you just eat a diet which is very high in refined sugars and very high in proteins, let's say, and I'll come back to that in a minute, then the microbes in the gut are going to, first of all, be starved, because they rely, most of them anyway, rely on the provision of what we call complex carbohydrates. And complex carbohydrates are things like fibers. So high fiber diet is a healthy diet. We know that. Perhaps you didn't know why. This seems to be the reason why. So if you eat a high fiber diet, basically you're feeding your microbes, you're feeding your gut microbes, and those gut microbes in return are churning out a whole bunch of molecules which are actually very beneficial to your health. So some of the audience members might have heard of a molecule called butyrate, for example. This is a really important molecule, one of many important molecules, but this one has had a lot of attention. And butyrate is a what we call a short chain fatty acid, and it's made through fermentation, which is a chemical process that the microbes do, and it's fermentation of carbohydrates, of complex carbohydrates. And so only if you eat fiber are you going to churn out a lot of butyrate, and that butyrate turns out to be extremely important for the health of your gut in many different ways. And so, yeah, so that there's a lot going on in terms of health.
So from your own perspective, has this changed your own diet? Is there a
Yes.
You might eat that lots of the rest of us don't eat?
Yeah, so I sort of grew up with a lot of weight issues, and I've got most of them under control now. Now I look back and I think my diet was pretty horrible, and I didn't realize at the time that it was horrible, because everyone was eating what I was eating, and that was the way I was brought up. When I really looked into it, I realized how terrible it was. So once I started working on the microbiome quite a few years ago now, I changed things very dramatically. And as a result, my health is way better than it ever was. And so I have increased the amount of fiber I eat. One of my rules is that I don't eat anything which is processed, if I can help it. I mean, sometimes it's impossible, but for the most part, I don't eat any processed food. What does that mean? I don't eat fast food, junk food, or any of that. I try and look at the labels of the foods that I do buy. So if I can, I'll cook from scratch, because that's easy now, and you know, that's once you get into the habit of doing it, it's a very easy thing to do. But if I can't cook from scratch and I want to buy something off the shelf, I'll look at the label, and if the label has something in there that I can't pronounce very easily, then I probably won't eat it. I think that's the golden rule.
Must be bad by definition.
Yes. And so that's one of the things that I do for sure. The other thing that I do is I avoid all food additives. That would be colors, preservatives, emulsifiers, all of those things, sweeteners, very definitely, because we know that those affect the gut microbiome. And then finally, I try to avoid as much as possible anything antimicrobial. And that's a very difficult thing to do, because if a doctor tells me that I need to take an antibiotic, of course I'm going to take an antibiotic. My doctor knows best, and doctors do not prescribe antibiotics frivolously anymore. So it's very much some stewardship there. So if a doctor tells you need to take an antibiotic, you should probably take that antibiotic. But when I do so, I'm very mindful of the fact that I might be damaging my microbiome by taking that antibiotic. So I take extra care to build it back up again by eating a very healthy diet for a few weeks after that. And so far, so good. I mean, hopefully I won't have to take too many antibiotics, but some people have to, and that's to keep well, and that's important as well.
So I'm really enjoying this, and we could go on chatting, but I think in fairness, I think you've really brought home a lot of very useful information, and you've reminded us of all these kind of feelings, of gut feelings, and all the kind of, it's funny how the language emerged before we probably had any sense of the gut microbiome. I think it's been fascinating to see the robo-gut and how people can do the work extra corporal, as it were, outside the body, and obviously advancing the field. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague at HRI, Becky Rothwell, who is our communication coordinator. And Becky will actually bring questions from you, the audience, to Emma, and hopefully we'll have a fairly active discussion, albeit without a chat room, but with Becky having your voice. So I'll hand over to you, Becky.
Thank you, Sid. We have a lot of questions coming in, and we actually had quite a few questions submitted in advance as well. So as you might have guessed, we are getting a lot of questions about probiotics. With so many products available, is there anything backed by science, and what insights can you share about the use of probiotics?
Yeah, so okay, probiotics is a really interesting topic, and unfortunately also a little bit of a trap if you don't know what you're looking at. So the thing about probiotics that you have to remember is that they are they're supplements, they're regulated as such. So they're not drugs, they're supplements. And so as the result of that, there's very little oversight from government and regulatory agencies on the effectiveness of probiotics. And as a result of that, there's an awful lot of quote unquote snake oil out there. And so how do you know whether a probiotic is good or not? So first of all, what is a probiotic? So a probiotic, by definition, is a microbe that if you take it, a live microbe, that if you take it in high enough concentrations, it has a beneficial effect on your health. And so that's the definition. It's quite a broad definition, as you'll appreciate. So what a probiotic isn't is things like everyday yogurt. Fermented foods are not probiotics, they're not defined as such. And I think that there's a lot of misinformation out there about what a probiotic is and isn't. So probiotics do actually have beneficial effects on health. The ones that have been shown to have beneficial effects on health have been through all sorts of clinical trials. And what you need to know is that there are several mostly bacterial species that have probiotic effects, but it's the strain of the species that's important. So in other words, you could have two different strains of let's say a microbe called Lactobacillus acidophilus. And those two strains, they could be as different from each other genetically as chalk and cheese. Even though they're the same species, bacteria can vary very much in terms of the genes that they carry. It's very different to genetics between human beings, for example. And so as a result of that, just because a microbe turns out to belong to the species Acidophilus, Lactobacillus acidophilus, doesn't mean that that strain has the same effects as another strain which has proven effects. And so it's very important when you go to look for a probiotic that you look for a probiotic that has proven clinical effects, that has a strain with proven clinical effects. And there's actually a really useful little website to do this now, because it's recognized that this is very difficult for the average person to go and figure out what's a good probiotic and what's not. So there's a fantastic website. And I think it's going to pop up at somewhere on the screen, I hope, so that people can see it, or in the Q&A section. And this website, well, you can go to this website and actually see the level of evidence for all the different probiotics that are available so far in Canada. Some of them might be available elsewhere in the world as well. And it'll show you the clinical benefits that have been proven through the use of these probiotics for a given indication. So the other very important thing to remember about a probiotic is that they're not a panacea. So it's that you have this sort of idea that you can just go to your health food store and pick up a probiotic and it will treat whatever ails you. So, you know, you take a probiotic for whatever. Just because a probiotic has clinical efficacy against, let's say, antibiotic-associated diarrhea, it doesn't mean that it necessarily will be proven to be efficacious against depression, for example. So you have to be very careful. And then the other thing to remember is that everyone has a different gut microbiome, as I mentioned. And so the actual response that you might have to a given probiotic might be quite different from the person sitting next to you. So they are very safe, that's the benefit, and relatively inexpensive compared to some drug products. And so I always say it's worth a try. They're not going to do you any harm, but they're not necessarily going to cure everything. So just to be very careful.
Excellent, thank you. And I pasted that link into the Q&A. There were several questions related to probiotics. So I have posted that in the Q&A for folks who want to see that. Another question that's coming up, really looking, I guess, to unpack a little bit more of the connection between mental health and microbiome. And I've had a specific question about what are the scientific methods to study the microbiome and brain connection. You have touched on some of that, but maybe just to expand, if you can, a little bit more. There are also questions, Emma, about neurotransmitters in the gut and things like that.
Right. Okay. So I think that the general theme in terms of the microbiome in mental health is, as I mentioned, what are the microbes doing rather than what they are, what their species names are. They don't just hang around in your gut doing nothing. They're important. They interact with you. So some of the themes that have emerged more recently are that for example, inflammation is important, and inflammation in the gut in particular can lead to a situation that we call leaky guts. So it means that things which are in the guts that should be kept well away from your bloodstream are able to make it into your bloodstream and then cause your immune system to overreact, and that causes an inflammatory reaction. And leaky gut is a very difficult thing to define, very difficult thing to test for even, but does seem to be important in some mental health disorders. And so that is definitely an area of research. How do you get leaky gut? Well, it seems that there are certain bacteria in the gut that when they overgrow, or when they are stimulated to grow too much, might produce some molecules which can start to cause this problem. And so diet, turns out, is also very important in terms of mental health. Another area of research that's really starting to turn up some interesting things is the molecule tryptophan, which is an amino acid. It's an essential amino acid. The way that the body processes tryptophan, it can do it essentially through two different pathways. One that ends up in the production of serotonin, and another one that ends up in the production of a molecule called kynurenine. And those two pathways are understanding how those two pathways work is one thing. And what we've come to appreciate recently is that the microbes in the gut have a large role in influencing how tryptophan is handled by the body. And so as a result of that, the molecules that come out the other end obviously can be in balance or not. And so having a balanced microbiome is important. Probably going to ask me next, well, what is a balanced microbiome? And unfortunately, we don't have a definition for what a balanced microbiome is yet. We don't know. We can sequence lots of people's microbiomes and we can see what's there, but because everyone has a different gut microbiome, it's very difficult for us to really understand what health is. What does a healthy microbiome look like? And so we don't have a definition for that. So there's no test for it right now. All that we've been able to show, which I mentioned earlier, is that diversity is important. So the more diversity you have in your gut microbiome, the likelihood of you being healthy is much higher. And the reason for that as well, as I mentioned, is that these microbes are making a lot of metabolites. They're doing a lot of biochemistry for you. So the more microbes that you have carrying out this biochemistry, some of which is very mysterious to us, and we don't even know, we don't have names for the chemicals that are being produced, or we don't know how they interact with the body. But clearly these molecules are important. And so we don't want to lose these molecules.
Thanks, Emma. These questions are really just pouring in. What would you say is the #1 intervention to fix the gut?
I think it's diet. I think that's a very important intervention, but there are a few other things that you can do as well as diet. So diet it's not going to fix a bad gut. If you already have a poor microbiome, you're not going to increase diversity necessarily through the diet that you eat, or if you are, it's going to be very slow. So sometimes there's a point in which a poor microbiome is a poor microbiome, and it's very difficult to manage that. The only way that we know so far is through actually introducing other microbes, and even that is a very inexact science right now. So diet is one way. But we also have to think about how do microbes come into the gut in the first place? And so again, that's we're starting to understand that. It's still a very mysterious process. We don't understand how microbes stick around for as long as they do. That probably has something to do with the immune system. And so if you have a poo print, as I mentioned, and your microbes stay with you for long periods of time, then it's probably going to be very difficult to shift that. Because if it was that easy to shift, then we wouldn't see those kinds of long lasting patterns through life. And so does that mean that we can't augment our microbiomes with probiotics and things like that? No, it doesn't mean that. It means that we can do that, but those microbes that we add into our diet or into our bodies probably don't have the capacity to stick around. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe if they do stick around, then that could cause havoc with our immune system. So we don't really understand all that right now. But it does mean that you can do things like take probiotics and also take fermented foods. And fermented foods are interesting to me because fermented foods comes from the name. These are foods which have been fermented, and that fermentation process is actually the process that produces a lot of beneficial molecules. So I actually think that fermented foods are beneficial to your body because of the molecules that are in them, not necessarily the microbes, because the microbes will die very soon after, if they're not dead already through the process of fermentation, will die pretty soon after they hit your stomach. But the molecules are very stable molecules. And so it's possible that fermented foods might be beneficial that way. Another way that you can really benefit your health or your microbiome, and through mysterious ways that we haven't figured out yet, is actually through connection with nature, probably because you're picking microbes up from the soil. It's very difficult to do that in a country like Canada at a time like this when it's so cold outside. But it does seem that a connection with the soil is important, and children, for example, that are brought up in a rural environment where they have interaction with soil far more than they would do in an urban environment seem to have a more diverse microbiome. And owning a pet is actually associated with that as well. So if you have a pet like a dog or a cat that goes outside and then sort of comes in and lies all over you, then that's probably beneficial as well in a way that we've starting to understand. And yeah, so I think there are many other things that we can do. Oh, the other one I wanted to mention was exercise. So exercise, it turns out, does actually seem to influence your microbiome. So those people that exercise more, particularly middle-aged women, so women my age, if you exercise for at least 30 minutes a day, at least 4 or 5 times a week, that seems to somehow influence your microbiome diversity in a way that, again, we don't really understand at the moment. But it seems to be perhaps interacting with our immune system, which is a sort of a major component of our microbiome as well.
Thank you. I know we're getting kind of down to the wire here. It's about 10 to 8. I just wanted to say, so we are getting a lot of questions. What I'm trying to do is pool the most commonly asked questions here. If your question isn't answered tonight, you're welcome to connect with us. Just visit our website, hriresearch.com, and you can find our contact information there. Feel free to email us with any questions you might have that are outstanding. In the meantime, a big question that's coming up: do mental health and psychotropic medications affect the microbiome?
Yeah, okay. So this is a really interesting area of research right now. And it's so all medications really need to come under a lot more scrutiny. So yes, it does turn out that some medications that are taken for mental illnesses do affect the microbiome. The issue with this is, what does that mean? We don't really necessarily know. At the moment, most of the studies have been done just looking at, again, at what's there. So they've just sequenced things of looking at the DNA, and they're able to see that the microbes and the proportions of the microbes that are present in the gut change when a person starts taking a drug substance. And some drug substances have more of an effect than others. The problem is that, that just knowing what's there and the abundance that they're in doesn't necessarily dictate what they might be doing. And so the next phase of this research is to do kind of what we're trying to do in the lab right now, which is to understand what the microbes do in response to these drugs. And that is probably far more important. Things like we've known for a long time that antibiotics, of course, they're antimicrobial, so you might expect them to have an effect on the microbiome, and they have sometimes a profound effect on the microbiome. But a few years ago, some studies were done to take the most common medications that are prescribed every year, and some which are over-the-counter medications as well, and to see what they did to the microbiome, with some really surprising results. So even something like acetaminophen, pain-relieving medication, can have an effect on the microbiome. And certainly there are some drugs which are taken for depression and anxiety, for example. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SRIs, are known to have an effect on the microbiome. Some drug products actually require the microbiome in order to provide their effects. So they're actually broken down by microbes in the gut to release another compound that actually has the beneficial effect. So we need the microbiome there to do something. And some other drug products or drugs which can be taken by some people to give an effect, and other people, they have no effect at all. And nobody could really understand why that is, because, you know, humans really have pretty similar DNA to each other. So we couldn't understand that until we started to look at our other microbiome, which is our gut microbiome. Excuse me. And when we started to look at the gut microbiome, we realized that for some people, they carry microbes that can actually break down drug products, and other people don't have these microbes. And so that really explains why there's a very personal effect of drugs on a given person's microbiome. And so just generically prescribing drugs, we have to do that now because there's no real way of doing it otherwise. It's just to try and see. I think in the future, what we'll find is that your doctor will take some kind of measurement of what's going on in your gut microbiome and prescribe medication based on that. So things will become a lot more personalized in the future, and then hopefully a lot more sort of trained to do something. Now, the fact that microbes have an effect, or drugs have an effect on microbes, as I mentioned, is not necessarily a bad thing, because it may actually be how that drug product works. So I think it's very important that everyone realizes that if they're prescribed a drug by a doctor and it's working for them, that they should continue to take that drug. They shouldn't worry about the microbiome necessarily, because we know enough through medicine, and we've done enough clinical trials with the medication that we do prescribe, that doctors know when a drug product has more benefits, and that the risk to benefit equation is firmly on the side of benefit.
So we are at 7:54. We've got 1 or 2 minutes, maybe one more question, something that's coming up, implications for IBS. Could you speak briefly about that?
Yeah, so IBS is a really interesting disease, a disorder. It comes in many forms, and it's probably more than one disorder, but it comes under like this umbrella term. What's really interesting about IBS is that it has a comorbidity often with depression and anxiety. And so it seems that there is something going on with the microbiome and products of the microbiome which are then affecting the brain. And again, we don't really understand the full details of this, again, because there are so many differences between, one patient with IBS might have a very different type of IBS to another. And when we look at the microbiomes, the gut microbiomes of IBS patients, we don't really see too much that is similar between different patients. So it's not like we can point out a particular microbe that could be causing the problem. What we do see almost universally is a lack of diversity. So it does seem to be that if you have IBS, that you just are missing microbes that perhaps have an important effect on physiology. And those microbes might be producing, let's say, enzymes that can break down compounds that might otherwise be causing anxiety. And when they're missing, then that can be an issue. And I have done some work in the past with a colleague, Alan Lomax at Queen's University, looking at a microbe called, it's got a long name, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii. And this microbe is a sort of a probiotic of the future. We think is a very beneficial microbe in the gut. And what we found was that this microbe actually produces a molecule which is which blocks pain receptors in the gut. And so if you're missing this molecule, so you're missing this microbe, which many people with IBS seem to have very low numbers of it. The nervous system, the afferent nervous system, is almost like it's overactive, and then pain and discomfort is felt. And it's but when you have Faecalibacterium prausnitzii there, it's producing a molecule which is actually breaking down these compounds which would otherwise stimulate the nervous system of the gut. And so it's those. I mean, I don't doubt that that's just one of very many different mechanisms by which IBS can cause a problem. But just seeing how this happens, and you sort of realize how complicated the gut microbiome is, how important it is to kind of preserve diversity to sort of prevent this kind of thing happening. And I think in the future, what we hope to see is therapies where we can reintroduce these types of microbes that have these beneficial effects to hopefully relieve some of those symptoms, and at the same time relieve some of the symptoms of anxiety and depression that seem to go with it. Thank you, Emma. I'm going to pass it back to Sid now for some closing remarks. And again, if your question wasn't answered and you want to connect with us, info@hriresearch.com. Back to you, Sid.
Wow, I think that was terrific, Emma. I think you gave us a tremendous overview, and boy, did you handle the questions. I think that was a real barrage. You know, it struck me that, just one comment, it's been fashionable for maybe the last 5 years for people to get what they call pharmacogenomic testing. And there's a bit of a misinformation, in my opinion. What it's telling us is really how antidepressants are metabolized, and we have different liver enzymes that do that. But people are paying a lot of money to get these sequencing, which can tell you if you're going to be more sensitive to one drug, or if you're going to be a rapid metabolizer and you'll need a higher dose of another drug. But I wonder, do you foresee, or do we even have an equivalent gut microbiome test like that?
Yeah, it's coming, I think. So not anytime soon, because as I mentioned, it's incredibly complicated and everyone has a different microbiome. But I think it's starting to be recognized that we really have to look at this because we cannot just we can't just expect drugs to be the same, to work the same way in everyone. When we have this whole other microbiome, this whole other genome, if you like, of our bodies, not just a human genome, doing something with these drugs. And so understanding that is very important. So I think what we'll see in the future, as I mentioned, is that you would have some kind of test done to see what types of microbes you have, or what types of functions, I should say, these microbes have, to be able to make predictions about the types of drugs and the dosages of drugs that you need to take in order to have an effect. And so that is something that is not done right now. We will look back on this time and wonder how we ever managed to do modern medicine, because it's just such a difficult thing for doctors to prescribe drugs when they really don't have an idea how they might work. A lot of it is just suck it and see. And so I think in the future there'll be a lot less of that guesswork and a lot more precision medicine, which I think is what everyone wants to see.
Took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly, I think, where we're going, and this is a major contribution. I wish we had more time. For people who didn't get, and I saw the number of questions, there are obviously quite a few that could be answered. If this was a live concert, we'd be booking the next night to bring you back for a second night. But you can contact us through hriresearch.com. I really want to thank you, Emma, for a spectacular presentation and an absolutely broad and thorough response to multiple questions from various directions. It's very clear this is a hot topic and one that we'll hear a lot more about. And actually, thank you to the audience, because I think you brought excellent questions to the table. And I hope some of you felt that you got answers that were helpful. If you would like to see a recording of this event, you can go to YouTube within, I think, 3 or 4 days, and you'll have access. So we're going to send out a brief survey and ask you just to take a couple of minutes to give us feedback on today's conversation, to help you to improve, tell us to improve future talks. And just to sweeten the pot, there's a $25 gift certificate to a lucky completer of the survey. So please take a couple of minutes and do that. We also would like to invite you to attend future HRI Talks and follow our work. If you haven't already subscribed to our email list follow us on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube or Instagram. I think the only thing missing is TikTok. We'll be hosting the next event on March 30th from 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with our HRI senior scientist, James McKillop. I'd like to really thank our sponsors, Fusion Homes, and our other HRI Talks sponsors, CIBC and KPMG. Without this sponsorship, we would not be able to deliver excellent presentations like tonight. So I want to thank everyone for being part of this 300 attendee event and perhaps even more. And we look forward to seeing you all next time. So good night or good morning, wherever you may be. And thank you for joining us. Thank you very much.